Good afternoon, everyone. This is Karen Vasquez. I'm with C3 Integrated Solutions. Thank you all for joining us today on our webinar, Fast Tracking Your CMMC Compliance. Without further ado, I am going to transfer over to Bill Wooten here. Bill is our Chief Revenue Officer with C3 Integrated Solutions. He has been living and breathing CMMC now for, I don't know, Bill, years, a decade? Probably not quite that much. Yeah, but it probably feels that way. Bill, please take it away. And thanks again, everyone, for joining us.
And I want to thank everyone as I start off here today. Thank you, Karen, for getting the introduction. Obviously, today we're going to talk about fast tracking your CMMC compliance as we move forward. As Karen mentioned, my name is Bill Wooten. I'm Chief Revenue Officer here at C3 Integrated Solutions. Don't let the salesy title fool you. Been very, very involved in a lot of different levels and a lot of different ways around supporting the defense industrial base for a very long time now, almost 10 years, a little more than 10 years now, directly supporting the DIB, and in particular, over 8 years supporting it through DFAR 7012 and GCC High and NIST 800-171, all the things that started to come about right around that 2017 timeframe, and then being able to kind of help our clients learn as the industry evolved and make sure that they can satisfy the requirements that they have, again, in this actually in some ways fast moving environment from a compliance standpoint. From a presentation standpoint today, I'm going to do a very quick update on CMMC, just a couple of slides on that. This is not intended to be a CMMC 101 presentation. We have a lot of great content on our webinar, on our website that will cover that type of content. And if you're just getting started out to CMMC, if there's things that aren't making sense to you, feel free to reach out to us. We do a lot of coaching and a lot of education in addition to working with our clients on overall solutioning around it. Then I'm going to walk through the 5 keys to CMMC success. This is really kind of helping folks get from day one to getting to that point where they're ready to start preparing for their assessment, sit down for their assessment. We're going to do a little bonus section about the actual assessment experience. And then we'll talk a little bit about our approach, C3's approach to helping our clients meet this challenge of CMMC. So real quick, just a slide or two about who we are as an organization, as C3 Integrated Solutions. We design, implement, and manage purpose-built IT security and compliance services for the defense industrial base. And so what that means is we are not necessarily a pure play consultant. We are not a C3PAO, but we sit in the service provider space. Think system integrator, managed service provider, managed security provider. That space is going to sit alongside you as you go through the process, and even in the assessment itself, we will sit alongside you answering the questions on your behalf. We are one of the first service providers to pass an internal CMMC level 2 assessment. We're super proud of that. Both our managed services and our managed security platforms have passed their internal level 2 assessment experience. Again, mentioned before, we have over 10 years working with the DIB and 8 years working with Microsoft in their GCC High environment as part of one of the first 5 AOSG partners. Our managed stock is also in-house, which ensures that we take that security first approach to where we go with things. You can see some of the logos on the side, obviously being a Microsoft solution partner. It's the base of what we do, registered practitioner with Cyber AB, and then a couple little accolades there from an industry standpoint, showing that we're not only deep into this space, but widely recognized at a different level, both in the MSP community and as one of the fastest growing companies. Now, the value that C3 brings when we talk about what is going to make us different and how are we going to be able to support you, it's really that integration of the managed IT, managed cybersecurity, and managed compliance services, allowing us to deliver a complete solution to our clients. And that comes off of a foundation of certainly having the ability to do licensing. I mentioned our AOSG experience and the ability to do project-based professional services. Think implementations, upgrades, maybe merger and acquisitions, combinations, those types of things as well. So enough about the early commercial. Let's talk a little bit about CMMC. And from a CMMC perspective, as I mentioned, this really isn't intended to be a CMMC 101 webinar. There were a couple things that I want to kind of talk about that will help frame our conversation today. First one was DoD in a presentation, geez, probably about 6 or 8 weeks ago now, dropped this slide into there that I think was incredibly helpful in terms of putting into perspective the CUI, and the CUI, frankly, you need to worry about as you go through this. So those 4 boxes to the left there represent level 1, the 2 components of level 2, and then level 3, when we talk about CMMC, the types of data that will be involved in CMMC. Level 1 is obviously FCI, level 2 is CUI, and then level 3 is even more sensitive CUI data. What's interesting here is when you look at this yellow box in the center, that it shows the different topics, the different areas that the NARA, the National Archives, shows in their CUI registry that would be considered CUI. And there's some things in here like proprietary information and financial and legal and PII information that is very much considered CUI from a NARA perspective, but from the programmatic level at CMMC, that's going to be viewed as more of a self-assessment requirement. It's that box that's X'd out there, the defense one, which is what's represented on this slightly darker, golder box there. Those are things like controlled technical information, DoD critical infrastructure security information, naval nuclear propulsion, and unclassified controlled nuclear information defense. Those are the things that we're going to see, specifically certification requirements, which means third-party assessments on it. Now, one of the interesting things about this is export control, which is the box sits next to the defense one, actually technically may not require a certification, but I would call out most export controlled information is also considered controlled technical information, so you're going to see a lot of overlap there. Next up is timelines, and the question that everyone has right now, a lot of folks in so many different ways are waiting on what's going to happen next. And what we're expecting, we're waiting for what's called Title 48 to be published and be reviewed and go into final effect. It is sitting in a final draft form. The DoD is working on it. There's a ton of speculation on it. I'm not going to kind of go into the rumoring of it, but the full expectation, I think, industry-wide is we will see Title 48 sometime this year, and there's a fairly good chance that it will probably become effective sometime before the end of the year or shortly after the beginning of the year. Now, that's important for so many reasons. First off, Title 48 is what will trigger CMMC in actual contracts. So that's when it gets, I hate to say real because it's real now, but in terms of being contractual requirements, that's when it'll become real. That also triggers the phases outlined in Title 32. Immediately on day 1, we're going to have phase 1, where self-assessments can be included as a condition of award in contracts almost immediately. 1 year after that, we'll see phase 2 come into play. Phase 2 is where we can see certifications as a condition of award in applicable contracts. So if you're thinking about when it's really going to be real, that's kind of the time frame that you're looking at, is probably sometime late next year. But that's a lot sooner than it seems, and I'll talk about that in a slide or two. And then obviously we work through phases 3 and 4 as we go through the timeline. So this is a little bit of information. We did a poll last year in the 3rd quarter. We had over 100 folks respond to the poll. Over 70% of those said that they needed level 2. So the baseline information, the folks that were responding to this poll were all people that were aware of CMMC, had an understanding of it, and knew that they needed level 2 as their requirement. And even with that knowledge and understanding, 60% of those folks said that they were a year or further away in their readiness. And this just kind of goes to the point of all through last year, and we still see a little bit of it this year, folks have really delayed the adoption of CMMC. Now, I can also tell you anecdotally, that's changed pretty significantly since Title 32 has gone into effect. People are very much more active, more interested. Folks have put it in their budgets and are executing on projects this year at a much higher clip than they were, say, 9 months ago or so. So when we talk about CMMC and when we work with our clients to kind of coach them through what the process is and help them understand what does it take to be successful with CMMC, we will typically talk about 5 different steps that they will need to pass through in order to get to that point where they are ready to sit for an assessment. This starts with building a strategy. You have to get off on the right foot. You have the right foundation for success. If you do this part right, all of the other pieces start to line up and start to make a lot of sense. If you miss the strategy piece, you can find yourself spending a lot of extra money and a lot of extra time, and maybe even doing things that will hinder your ability to be successful at the end of the process. There will always be a technical deployment component of it. At some point, once you set your strategy and your compliance boundaries, you are then going to need to probably deploy some level of services. That may be system upgrades, it may be some versioning updates, or it may be a completely new greenfield environment. Once that is deployed, frankly, you haven't done that much from a CMMC assessment objective standpoint. The bulk of the assessment objectives really are centered around ongoing management and security monitoring. So deployment will get the configurations in place. It'll set the stage for you to achieve compliance. But really, there's a reason maturity is in the term CMMC. It's about having that ongoing practice and continuing to maintain your compliance stature over time. That's where the management and the security monitoring come into play. And then finally, compliance management is your documentation. It's your program, your ability to be able to document and reflect what you are doing in your system from a documentation standpoint and keeping that in alignment. So when we talk about building your CMMC strategy, what we are really looking at is, understanding your business. Yeah, it's the first thing you've got to really understand. I'll explain how that really has a big impact on your strategy. At that point, it's going to help you understand what your system boundaries are going to be from a compliance standpoint. Literally, the first thing an assessor is going to ask you for is your compliance scope. What is in scope? What is out of scope? And this setting the boundary is absolutely the cornerstone of everything you're going to do moving forward. But you also need to understand what the organizational impact is once you set that boundary. And then based on how well you feel about those first three items, that will help you determine whether or not you need external expertise to help you sort some of that out. We'll guide you through a little bit of the scenarios where people do that along the way. So understanding your business is about both external and internal factors. External, this is going to sound a little bit common sense, but it's actually really important to think through this a little bit. Who are the agencies that you're working with? What is the type of deliverable you're providing to your customers? Is it a tangible requirement? Is it a staffing requirement? Is it some level of analysis or engineering? Understanding what you're doing and delivering to the government will help you understand what level of data you have and what systems are in there. Obviously, your partners actually have a little bit of a higher focus on this than you might expect. Okay, if you are aligned with particular clients, teaming partners and particular larger primes, you have to understand what their requirements are going to be when you're working with them. We'll talk in a minute about how their timelines might be more accelerated than what the calendar is that we just showed a couple minutes ago. At that point, you should start taking a look at your contracts. If you have clause DFAR 7012 in your contracts today, there's almost a guarantee you will see CMMC when it comes out and when it starts to roll out itself. And then finally, what's your future? We've talked to prospective clients who frankly are exiting the business and it's not a near-term concern for them and they know that they want to be out in 12 months and maybe this isn't a right fit. There's no need to invest. On the opposite side, we've talked to clients and prospective clients who maybe have contracts with DHS and labor and energy, and they know they want to move into DoD in the next 12 months. They should be making those investments so that they're ready when these requirements come online. This will also have an influence on your internal factors. Understanding the people who both directly and indirectly deal with CUI. Some folks may make a lot of sense. There's someone on the shop floor that's downloading a file. Maybe there's a engineer that's doing some analysis. But think about the people that are indirect as well. Folks that are maybe accounting or contract management or executives or BD people. The more people you identify that will at least at some point interact with CUI will become really important when we start making decisions in a couple of minutes. Obviously, you want to look at what systems store, process, or transit data, and you want to look at whether or not you can de-scope some of these systems. The example we always use here is your customer relationship management software, your CRM system. Maybe today you're putting data, contractual data into your Salesforce system, for example, but some process changes will remove that data. You can avoid it and then take Salesforce and make it completely out of scope from an assessment standpoint. These are things that are really important so that you can understand what's the minimum scope you can handle and that will minimize your cost and your time to get compliant. And then obviously, do you have CUI? And do you have export control data? And I call those things out differently because the rules are different for export control data. You will have data sovereignty requirements that are above and beyond CMMC, and you need to factor both of those into what systems, what versions of systems you're going to choose. So for example, if you have CUI data, Microsoft GCC may be perfectly acceptable. If you have export control data or ITAR data, you're going to need to go to the GCC High version. Now, we talked a minute ago about the impact with your prime contractors and your supply chain, and this is important because CMMC requires you to flow down to all tiers of your supplier base. If you are going to give a subcontractor, or you are a subcontractor receiving CUI data, then CMMC level 2 applies to you. And if you think about this for a minute or two, and you think about a prime contractor with the hundreds, maybe thousands of suppliers in their supply chain, think about what the administrative burden is for them to not only meet CMMC level 2, but meet it throughout their supply chain and validate that. That means that they need to put a certain amount of pressure on you to be ready. You may need you to be ready faster, and they may actually take and go and be a little more aggressive in that. If they think there's a chance you're going to get CUI, they're probably going to push you to get level 2 so they don't have to pay attention to what file they're given to each person on each individual contract. Now, also recognize that if there's a bid cycle, especially longer bid cycles that run 18, 24 months or so, you're going to realize very quickly that if I'm building my team today for something that's going to be awarded in a year or two from now, I need to be confident that those subcontractors, those key partners, are going to be ready. All of these things add up to the fact that what we're seeing is larger primes in particular are pushing their supply chain to be ready faster than the CMMC timeline. They don't want to find themselves at the end of this process when it's ready and they need it for contract award, that you're not ready to meet the challenge. All of this applies on the opposite in a mirror image if you are looking downstream to your supply chain. What contracts have it? What contractors, subcontractors are you using? Are they ready? Have they given you the confidence that they are going to be ready when you need them to be ready? Now, a big challenge in the choice and how you're going to pursue CMMC is, are you going to take an enclave approach or an all-in approach? And this is really like a fundamental crossroads that everyone faces early in the process. With an enclave, what you're doing is you're literally creating a separate IT environment that's going to be isolated from your corporate environment. Think of it almost as an air-gapped system. And the example I use here is generally if I had a 100-person company and I had 10 people that worked on a specific contract and maybe we're doing a specific amount of research and they kind of sat off in the corner and frankly, we don't even really talk to those guys over there. That's a great example of a good fit for an enclave. It's discrete, it's separable. I can identify exactly where the CUI data is and I can segment it off of my environment. Now, this approach has a lot of positives to it. It reduces your investment in the scope of what your compliance boundary is going to be. Frankly, it gives you a smaller attack surface relative to your cybersecurity profile. And it's a much more controlled system boundary so that you can really have a good understanding, a good solid line around what's in scope and what's out of scope on that end. There are some challenges, though, that come with an enclave. Those users, those individual users that are going to live in that enclave and live in your corporate environment, you will normally manage 2 identities with those users, and it creates what's called a swivel seat approach. Some days they'll be in one environment and they'll have to swivel their seat in a figurative way and log into the next environment. There can also be an illusion of cost savings with an enclave. What we've seen is as they start off small, 5, 10, even 15% of a company, you can actually get value in terms of a lower support cost and a lower licensing cost based on what you might be doing in your corporate environment. But you have to recognize that those identities you're going to pay 2 licenses for. You're probably going to double your support cost for them. So at a certain point, you're going to hit an inflection point that it's actually cheaper to go all in. Now, all in is essentially the opposite type of scenario. If I have a 100-person company and 80% of my team and my revenue is all connected to the DoD, if I know my data is mixed in with my corporate data and I can figure out which file is which, but I can't really separate them very easily, an all-in approach really starts to make sense. This is where you're going to bring the entire organization into compliance. You're going to build your compliance boundary around the entire company as opposed to just a segmented part of it. And generally here, you're going to have the advantages of a single consolidated environment, and you're going to normally do some fairly large technical upgrades or updates, which will give you the ability to eliminate whatever technical debt you have. Now, this, as you might expect, is a little bit more of a costly approach. There's going to more than likely be a data migration involved in it. It's going to have a higher user impact. And then everyone is going to be living in that locked down environment, which has an impact on some of the things that other groups may or may not be able to do that will create holes in your compliance boundary. So now that we have our strategy in place and we understand that, and I'll actually kind of go back a second in terms of, this is such a critical step. And if you're confident that you know which direction you're going and everything that we've talked to this point, that you know where your environment is and what you're dealing with, that's when you can kind of move into the next phase. If not, we do recommend that folks do look at a consultant to kind of come in, help them identify their CUI and help them build that strategic approach. Now we get to the second step here where we've got an approach. We're either going to go all in, we're going to go an enclave, we start doing the technical deployment. You need to recognize kind of what you're going to be up against for that when you go forward. In deploying enclaves, we do recommend a pilot approach. Start small, a handful of users, understand the impact in the operational environment. The reality is it's probably going to be very similar, but might not be exact to what they're doing today. And then adopt that enclave as appropriate. As contracts come online or you start to identify CUI, move more and more folks into the enclave. And importantly, when projects wrap up, take those users out of the enclave. Manage your licensing and your day-to-day costs by making sure that you don't have users that aren't using it still driving cost for you. And then watch for that inflection point. I talked a minute ago that at a certain point, as you add more and more users into your environment, it will actually start to be more expensive to run the enclave. In our 100-person example with 10 people, that's a great fit for an enclave. As it gets to 15 to 20 to 25 people, all of a sudden we hit a point where the licensing costs and the support costs start to basically be the same as if you were going to go all in. Now, there are other factors to consider there, but that's the point that you really want to start analyzing. Is it right for me to now take the jump and go into an all-in approach? And then maintain that discipline. Watch for unintended spillage. Make sure that folks understand where they're sending information on that contract that belongs in the environment. And in your corporate environment, set up scanning and DLP policies. So if someone inadvertently sends you a CUI document to your corporate environment, you can identify it, you can capture it, you can quarantine it, and mitigate that immediately without any problems. Now, from a technical standpoint, that all-in approach, as I mentioned earlier, is going to have a bigger impact from a data migration standpoint. You are going to more than likely be lifting and shifting your environment into an environment that is going to be FedRAMP moderate, may or may not be into an export controlled qualified environment. So you're going to wind up doing a lot more work from a technical standpoint. The other piece to recognize and acknowledge here is the entire company will be living in that restricted world. Security policies are going to apply to every asset that's in scope. So some assets that maybe not necessarily have CUI in them, but are part that gets sucked into the scope, become a little bit harder to approve, a little bit harder to manage. Third-party access, if you use consultants coming in and out, going to be much more highly regulated in the level of access you give them. And then sharing across environments from a CUI scoped environment to the outside world is also generally much more restricted than you would have in a normal corporate environment. So once we get deployed and we get operational and you're in the environment, you have to think about what's it take to run the environment from a day-to-day standpoint. Now, our perspective is as a managed service provider. That's who we are. That's a core of our business. So we look at it from this perspective. But this also applies to if you're managing the environment yourself. When we think of traditional IT management, some of the things that come to mind to us are managing the environment, the support desk, the business planning, things to keep the lights on and manage your day-to-day environment. Things like patching, maintenance, doing updates to your environment, answering the support needs of your clients, and in this case, who are your end users in your environment, whether that be a support incident or a service request, typical moves, adds, changes. budgeting, technical upgrade planning. All of these things are things you see every day in the management of an IT system. That doesn't even start to describe what it takes to do compliant management. When you are running an organization from a compliant perspective, from an IT management standpoint, it starts with standard processes. Your processes, things like onboarding, offboarding, things like you would do normally on a regular basis, all should be and need to be mapped to NIST 800-171 Alpha, so you're ready for that assessment experience. Everything you do should be viewed from the perspective of, I'm capturing a compliance artifact as the performance of that ticket, whether again that's an onboarding ticket or a support ticket or a regular administrative change on it. Your reporting and your reviews are going to be much more significant as well. Regularly checking configurations, whitelisting, access control, all these things need to get into a regular cadence, and you need to do this in a way that you can document it and show in your annual reviews and your triannual assessment, I have a robust, mature program with respect to operations. And then the last piece is change management, and this is generally the hardest piece because it requires the most discipline. You need to have your reviews, your approvals, your documented execution, all part of your change management process. And you kind of need to get comfortable saying no. If someone wants to, access an application or share some data in a way that isn't going to make sense from a compliance standpoint, you have to be very comfortable saying no. I can tell you, as a service provider who's gone through this process, we spent literally multiple years tearing down what we do every day and building it back up in a way that we could very confidently sit down and talk to our clients and explain to them how we're going to do this in a compliant manner and how we're going to sit down and sit next to you in that assessment process and be able to represent that we are running a robust compliance program as part of our operation of the environment itself. In addition to daily operations and management of the environment, you also have to look at the security monitoring standpoint. In a lot of ways, folks will look at this as an MSSP services, things like security monitoring, everything in scope. You need to make sure that your monitoring is very much in alignment with your audit policies and your plans, which basically means if you say you are monitoring events and you're doing certain things, you have to make sure that you can prove with reporting that you're capturing those logs and you're doing the review and the review that you need to do with that. And then you always need to proactively look for new events to be captured within your environment. Things like vulnerability scanning and threat hunting are absolutely part of the process, even though threat hunting technically is not part of it. It's very much a best practice. Vulnerability scanning is definitely part of the assessment process and the compliance process. And then you'll need to do an annual tabletop review of your incident response plan, where you'll literally go through a mock incident and walk through the different steps, who calls who, how do we escalate this, what do we go through from a process standpoint. Now, this is a slide I like to put into our presentations because it really kind of helps put into a perspective of the roles between a managed service provider, managed security service provider, and an incident response team. And these three groups all need to be able to work in hand, but they have different roles. MSPs, their role is to protect the environment, to deploy and maintain controls, things like antivirus and cloud access brokers, to stop unauthorized attempts. The role of the MSSP is to almost play security guard and be able to detect any behavior that doesn't belong and be able to escalate that to be tracked and investigated. If you reach a point where you may unfortunately have a situation that you have to respond as an incident, the incident response team is actually generally a separate group. At a certain point, you may want a dedicated incident response team that will come in and actually do the work to mitigate any damage, quarantine any threats, and then kind of kick them out of your environment. Now, these three groups may be under the same roof. For example, at C3 here, we have all three of these capabilities in-house, but in a lot of cases, an organization may have 2 or even 3 vendors who are performing these functions. The last step in our, in our 5 steps, 5 keys to success is the management of the compliance component of it. The key to a successful outcome from an assessment and the difference between running a very well organized lockdown environment and passing your assessment is your managed compliance, your policies and your procedures, your system security plan, and your customer responsibility matrix. Every vendor that you have in your system that has an active management role will need to provide you a customer responsibility matrix. The more vendors, the more folks that you're going to need to layer in and make sure that you are not having any unintended gaps. So more complexity comes if you have a separate MSP, a separate security provider, and a separate third-party consultant doing your documentation. You will need to review this documentation on a regular basis, keeping it current and updated. And then this is really where the extra effort comes in terms of maintaining that maturity, maintaining a current system diagram, making sure that the data flows are there. Going back to the operations, collecting artifacts continually as you answer and resolve support tickets, and then making sure that you are practicing an operational plan of action and milestones. Title 32 actually acknowledged that from time to time things change in an environment, and you may be doing a system change, and that will require a temporary operational POAM as you go through that process, and then as you close items out, you get back to that fully compliant state. So I'm going to shift gears a little bit here, and now that we've gone through the 5 steps, the 5 keys to success from a CMMC standpoint, I'm going to talk a little bit about how we apply it here at C3 with our C3 suite of services. Now, for us, this starts with a prescriptive design, a CMMC baseline design. When a lot of companies, they may come in and say, I'm going to look at your environment, I'm going to do a gap assessment, and I'm going to figure out how to patch it up. For us, we decided to go to market with a prescriptive approach that said, let's design a system that is robust and flexible, and we can meet compliance at scale, and then work with our clients to make sure that it fits their needs. And this features FedRAMP authorized services as required by DFAR 7012 wherever possible. We do use the FedRAMP authorized version of cloud services that we work with, and then having a very structured plan. We have in our compliance management standpoint, we have a very comprehensive 25 module curriculum that drives not only the technical assessment objectives, but supports and coaches you through the non-technical ones as well. So from a solution set standpoint, starts with C3 Command. And this is a service where we take command, we take control of your level 2 compliance journey, driving decisions and architecture to reduce your risk and deliver that shortest and safest plan to compliance. The counterpart to that is our C3 Catalyst solution. And with C3 Catalyst, we provide a little more flexibility, a little more wiggle room there in terms of what your unique requirements might be. And we act as the catalyst for that level 2 achievement, providing core building blocks and a recipe to make sure that you're successful in that assessment experience. And then complementary to Command and Catalyst, we have a solution called C3 Core, where a lot of our clients come to us and they say, look, I like what you do here on my compliance scope, help me with my corporate scope, and C3 Core was designed to fill that need itself. Now with C3 Command, this is intended to be as close as we can reasonably get to a solution that has a short window, a minimized risk of a non-successful assessment event, and as much as possible a turnkey type of solution. And we say turnkey in a very hesitant manner because the Cyber AB said on the last board, turnkey doesn't exist, and we do agree with that and we do believe that. But we do look to what are the things that we can take control over, take responsibility for, and alleviate as much of the pain as possible for our clients. That starts with a reference architecture that defines system use case and the boundary. That is that prescriptive approach that we talked about a minute ago. A system design based on FedRAMP authorized services that has already been vetted. We already know what we're deploying. We already have it mapped to 171, and we've gone through the assessment experience enough times to know that this is a qualified and going to be accredited design. And obviously performing the technical deployment that kind of goes with that as well. This is complemented by our managed IT services, which we talked about, not just the administration and the support, but having managed processes and procedures, managed configuration updates, and a continuous review and managed approach to the way we operate the environment. Our managed security features the standard things you would look for: 24/7 security monitoring, vulnerability management, IR preparedness, log management, and then threat intelligence, being able to make sure that we're actively looking for potential problems within your environment. Finally, the managed compliance services. This is our managed compliance program where we will do policies, procedures, assessment-ready documentation, annual risk assessments, and answer those random questions that'll come from time to time. A lot of times our clients will call us up and they'll say, hey, this prime contractor just gave me this questionnaire. Help me understand. I'm not sure I understand it. We'll walk through it and make sure that they're answering it accurately and completely, and wherever possible, doing what we need to do to make sure that they can answer it fully and comprehensively. So when we take C3 Command and we go back to the 5 steps that we talked about earlier in the presentation, you can see how that reference architecture really goes towards being able to take the strategy that our clients come to us with and execute not just the strategy, but the technical deployment associated with it. Our managed IT services support that ongoing management step. Security monitoring is met by the managed security step. And then finally, as you might expect, managed compliance will check the box on compliance management. So we've built our system, we've built our solutions specifically to address these 5 steps that you need to go through in order to be successful. Now we'll talk a little bit about C3 Catalyst from our, and how that matches up against C3 Command. This still has that proven architecture, that reference architecture that is going to be built on a defined use case with a system implementation, vetted baselines, and a FedRAMP authorized component of it. It's going to include the same managed services and managed security services that we would offer to our Command clients. One of the big differences with C3 Catalyst, though, is it allows for more flexibility with the compliance management program. A lot of times a client will come to us with a compliance consultant that they've done a lot of work on. They've already done that strategy piece too. They've got a plan for doing the documentation when they're ready for it, but they're looking for the other pieces to fit into it. C3 Catalyst is designed to be able to either provide that support or be able to provide a concierge service where we will work with that third-party consultant and be a bridge from the technicians working on your environment to the compliance consultant who's looking for the interpretation of the things that we've done. I would also say that C3 Catalyst also has a little more flexibility, whereas C3 Command, we want to manage the environment by taking ownership of the environment. With C3 Catalyst, we have a little more flexibility for our clients that still want to have an active role in managing the environment itself. And then finally with C3 Core, again, this is our IT services that would manage your non-compliance environment, being able to support your needs on the corporate side. As I mentioned, a lot of smaller clients in particular like us to be able to manage both pieces to it. It consolidates the vendor experience and gives them a unified approach to what they're doing from a IT and a cybersecurity standpoint. So want to add a couple extra slides as we wrap up kind of our prepared portion of the presentation here. Now that Title 32 is active and it's operational, now that we've gotten our own internal CMMC assessment and we're lining up assessments with our clients right now, I want to talk a little bit about what it takes to get ready for an assessment. And there's an important piece to note here that compliance maturity does not equal assessment readiness. And I look at it, the analogy I use here is if I'm a runner, and I am by no means a runner, but if I were a runner and I were to go out and I would run 5-ish or 10 miles on a regular basis and I've got a really good rhythm and I do that without really breaking a sweat, that's awesome. That's maturity. But if I decide I'm going to run a half marathon or a full marathon, I need to do a little bit of preparation for that. I need to go into a dedicated program to ramp up so that I'm at peak performance at the day of the event. Your assessment is your half marathon. That's what you need to think about it. You need to recognize that there will be a level of effort to be ready and some things that you should do to be prepared for it. So when we talk about this, there's some things that just sort of make sense. And one of those is call your vendors and tell them you're scheduling an assessment. We had some folks call up a couple months ago and say, hey, I'm ready for my assessment. I want to do it next week. And we're like, well, maybe you should check availability. Maybe you should check our capacity, and you should take a little look at, are you ready for that assessment? So provider capacity is a real thing. Those of us that are dedicated to this space are getting a heavy influx of folks that want to be in the front of the line, which is awesome, and we're excited about it, but we want to make sure that we're doing it right for you. And in a lot of cases, whether you're assessed today versus next month or next quarter may not mean that much to you in the big scheme of things, but have an impact on your ability to get ready and get ready without a lot of strain on your organization. Another piece is confirming your readiness. Make sure that you understand what your SPRS score is. Make sure that you have a minimum SPRS score of 88. You know, what you're going to need to get that conditional assessment in addition to anything you maybe need to clean up in order to be ready for it. Confirm your scope, your data flows. That is the first thing that they're going to ask for when they go through. And then go through your review of your SSP, your policies. Make sure those things are in alignment. Now, our practices are we build an assessment playbook, and that is how we cross-check things from a SSP to the deployment and capturing what we believe the evidence is going to be for each assessment objective so that we're ready when we sit down there to go through a process. A comment that I use and a term that I use a lot of times with assessors is competence breeds confidence. When you show that you know what the objectives are, you know where the screenshots are, when you know how to get to that portal and identify exactly what you're looking for, you will build momentum in your assessment. If you start tripping over things and you don't know where it is and you've got to go looking for it, you start to create doubt with that assessor, and just naturally they're going to be a little more skeptical of the answers that you're providing. We do strongly recommend a mock assessment. We know there are some C3PAs out there that are doing that. Even without that, we think it's really important to go through a mock assessment, especially when you have multiple parties participating in it. Mock assessments are designed to be a dress rehearsal, not to go answer questions, but to walk through every assessment objective and say, who's answering this one? Who's answering this one? It's a documentation question. It's going to be the compliance manager. It's a technical one. It's going to be the MSP. Going through that process will ensure when you get to the assessment, things go smoothly because everyone knows their role. And then finally, a change free. You don't want to be making a major change to your environment within a month, maybe even 2 months of your environment, especially if it's going to have an impact on your configurations and your documentation, because you've done all this work to get ready. You don't want to mess that up right before the assessment itself and cause some doubt. So with that, that kind of wraps up the prepared portion of our presentation. Karen, I'm going to bring you back on to see if we have any questions in the chat and kind of see what we can do to make sure we're answering those.
Great. Thank you so much, Bill. And again, thank you to everybody who's joined us today. Just another reminder that we will be sending out the webinar recording following the conclusion of the webinar, so you will get a copy. We do have about half a dozen questions that have been queued up. And everyone, please feel free to, if you've thought of something during the course of the webinar and want to put it in the Q&A module here, please go ahead and do that. But we'll get started with some of the questions that we do have loaded thus far. There was an early question from one of our attendees about CUI, and specifically around some technical drawings. I'm not sure, Bill, that you'll be able to answer it specifically, kind of without kind of seeing the detail of that. Sure. But in general, when it comes to technical drawings, things like that, I think might be helpful to get a sense of, how do you know whether it's CUI or not? Like, what are some of the things that might signal whether this is, this piece of information piece of data is CUI or is not CUI?
So it's an incredibly hard conversation to have. There's a lot of ambiguity out there. Karen, you prepped me pretty well on that, and the fact that that is not my personal area of specialty, and nor is it our as an organization as it. There are folks out there from an industry standpoint that are absolutely excellent, and they live their lives trying to figure these things out. If you reach out to us offline, we'd be happy to make some introductions around that. We're also in the process of planning a webinar in the next month or so that will feature CUI and all of its details and all of its nuances. We're bringing in a partner that's going to be able to provide that data because it really is its own niche and its own expertise. In general, though, I would say if you are working on technical drawings that are for something that will be export controlled, that will fall under ITAR or some other export control regime, anything that is going to be a technical technical design and implementation, a construction component, parts material, training related to it, there is a very, very high probability that that data will be export controlled and therefore considered CTI and should be treated as CUI. But that is very much a general rule. Stay tuned when we do the next webinar with one of our partners, and you'll get much better detail on that.
Great. Thank you very much, Bill. And then just for the general audience here, we do have a CUI markings guide that's available on our website. We'll send out also after this a few resources, and we'll include that, include a link to that one as well. Okay, so moving on, we've got another question around gap assessments. And I know the answer to this, Bill, but I would love for you to explain why. The question was, do we do gap assessments and how much do they cost?
Yes. So we shy away from gap assessments. We will handle, so I'll take two parts to the answer to that. In most cases, our clients are coming to us with an enclave-based strategy. And with an enclave, you're building a brand new greenfield environment. So the gap assessment really doesn't have a lot of value, kind of almost becomes a little bit of a waste of energy and money because we already know we're building a new environment for that compliance scope. In situations where a client may come to us and say, I think I know what I'm doing here, but I don't, I'm going to go all in, but I need X, Y, and Z. The fact that you're going all in means that you are creating an environment for your entire organization, and the gap assessment's probably going to get replaced. And we're going to go right into what's the technical debt retirement, what are we going to deploy on top of that or migrate you to in a way that's going to get you there. So there are plenty of situations where gap assessment makes a lot of sense. If you have if you've already made investments in a FedRAMP cloud systems and you've done things like ISO 27001 and you've built a really mature program, a gap assessment can have a lot of value if you think you are close. But if you look in the mirror and you know you're not that close, you're probably wasting some energy when you do a gap assessment.
Great. Thank you very much.
How'd I do? Did I get it right?
You did. Congratulations. You did get it right. All right, we're on a roll here. So next question has to do with, I think, kind of the size of firms that we have been working with. And I'll sort of combine a couple of questions into one. One is, is it feasible for a single person firm or a team of less than 5 to achieve and maintain CMMC? And then, what is the typical size of a company that really should be reaching out to us for help with their CMMC certification?
Yeah, sure. It's incredibly difficult for a single person firm or a team of less than, say, 5-ish or 10 people to get there. There is a certain cost to just doing the basics. When we light up a Microsoft 365 tenant and do the basics around documentation as well as all of the checks and things we do on a month-to-month basis, there's a minimal cost to come to that. And it's expensive. It's a very big challenge. The DoD has acknowledged that. They've talked in multiple ways, and I know they're doing work to try to resolve that issue. If you are a small shop, just several people, and you are more than likely the majority of your time is going to be on a single contract, whether that's with a prime or at a government location, put as much of that effort and energy into working on their environments. And then you might be able to get to a point where you can de-scope your environment. That's generally one of the better answers towards that. With that said, again, reach out to us directly if there's something we can specifically coach you on or give you some guidance. There's a couple of point solutions out there that also do a reasonably good job in very small places to give you a data repository that will also help you get there. In terms of what are the types of companies that we engage with and work with, we've worked with organizations across the board. We've worked with companies that are less than 25 users with a very successful outcome. We've worked with large multinationals who had a strategy to isolate their US operations and be able to deploy. When we think enclave, a lot of times we think of it as a small environment. Sometimes those turn out to be really big and large. We're more than comfortable with that approach because it's a discrete environment that's meeting their environment. So once you start putting those pieces in place, the scalability, especially upward, really stops being a challenge.
Great. Thank you, Bill. This next one is specifically around our C3 Command product and that shared responsibility matrix. So one of our attendees said, for C3 Command, what types of controls and level of effort are generally required for small businesses to sort of, remain in compliance? And I think it's probably getting to this idea of, we're taking 80% of all controls, 20% we help them, help folks through, but there are just some things that we can't do, right, around things like physical security. So if you could give it a general sense of what that looks like, maybe.
Absolutely happy to do so. So one of the things that makes our command solution unique and more unique in the environment is when we take control of the environment and we're the one managing it from an administrative standpoint, we can be much more assertive in our responsibility around the controls that we're going to take. If we're working with a client in our Cato solution and there's a shared responsibility, and by that I mean shared activity in the environment managing it, there's a little bit of a different approach to it. But with respect to command itself, and you may have noticed there was a little bar across the top of the graphic that said 80-20. That 80% means that we're willing to take ownership and responsibility for 80% of the assessment objectives. You can do the math on the 320 to get that number on there, but there are things inherently that frankly, you don't want us to do. You don't want us doing personnel background checks. You don't want us doing your physical security or managing your guest log. There are some things that, like, by definition, we shouldn't be able to do. And this was actually covered in the Cyber AB really well on the last call. For example, we should not be telling you who is authorized to be part of your environment. That's a business, that's a client's decision. You decide whether Bob is authorized to be involved in that environment and what they are authorized to have access to. I don't know Bob. I don't know if he's qualified, if he's passed a background check, done any of that stuff. That's the client's responsibility. We talk about those in terms of administrative objectives, assessment objectives and controls, things that are not really involved with the management and operation of the environment.
Great. Okay. Thank you very much for that. And then I think last question we have here, what is the process or what happens if you've achieved a CMMC level 2 and it's predicated on cloud-based CUI data, but then you get a new contract in the future that requires on-site CUI? Does that make sense?
Totally does. Absolutely.
Okay.
So the answer is we're not really sure. And I'll explain that. I'll make sense of that. Within Title 32, there is conversation within Title 32 that says if there is a significant change in your environment, then that may trigger a new assessment. Now, they didn't talk about what's that threshold for a significant change in your environment, and they didn't necessarily talk about triggering a new assessment, what that means. So as an industry, and I think to some extent the Cyber AB itself is still trying to kind of figure out exactly what that means, and there may be some guidance in the compliance assessment playbook, the CAP that was put out, that I'm not familiar with or aware of. My recommendation, though, is when you talk to your C3 PAO and you schedule your original assessment, if you think this is possible, then talk to them about it and say, hey, look, I'm doing X and Y and Z today, but there's a chance this might happen. And if you don't know it's going to happen up front, like, things happen, things change, next month another opportunity may pop up, you get a new contract, it pulls it in the scope, it wasn't something you're expecting, and that's fine. You still want to go back to your C3 PAO and say, I'm making I may need to make these changes in my environment. Can you help me understand what that's going to trigger? Even if they say it triggers a new assessment, I believe they have some level of discretion on, are we starting over? Are we doing something incremental? How do we approach this? That's really a question and a topic that your C3 PAO is going to be much better equipped to answer than someone that's on the service provider side of it. For us, we would look at it as an expansion of scope. We would look at the new assets that are in scope. We would build a technical solution. We would wind up mapping to whatever we needed to get to that point that we could then support you across the steps that we manage and run every day.
Great. And I think, Bill, that really speaks to, you know, that ongoing compliance management that we offer, right? That a company should look for in any of their solution providers, right? Someone who's going to be with them for the long term.
Absolutely. Great point, Karen.
I think that is about the time that we have today. There were a couple of questions that we didn't get to that were really, really very specific, you know, case specific and product specific. And I think it would probably be best to answer those offline. But is there anything, Bill, that you wanted to add before we wrap up here?
Yeah, it was, you know, had a chance to go to CMMC Day yesterday on Monday over here in College Park, Maryland. It was a really great event, really well put on, as it always is. But one of the things that those events kind of bring is the opportunity to talk to colleagues and other folks in the industry. And one of the things that was very much on top of mind was just how long this takes to be ready. If you haven't started and you're just getting ramped up, or you're just starting to make your decisions on this now, you should be budgeting a 12-month process from signature to assessment at least. And depending on the complexity of what you're doing, it may even take a little bit longer than that. We can pull that up a little bit with especially our command solution. We can do it a little bit faster than that. But if you're sitting there going, I'm going to get assessed at the end of the year, and you haven't done anything yet, you need to be reevaluating your expectations at this point, because you're going to put a lot of stress on your organization and your vendors that maybe isn't necessarily worth it. On the flip side, if you need to get ready, get started. Folks on the service provider side of it, as well as the assessor side of it, are just getting busier every day, and that wave's just building. So, you know, take action now as soon as you can.
Great. Thank you, Bill. It's great advice. And we'll address any unanswered questions that we had during the webinar offline. And then lastly, I'll send out a couple of good resources as well that might be helpful in answering some of the questions that I saw come through. So thank you all again for joining us. Really appreciate your time. As Bill noted, we're putting together a webinar specifically around CUI. So we'll be reaching out via email to let you know when that's going to be scheduled. We'll have future webinars on a variety of topics, you know, over the course of the next few months. We know that this is an issue that is top of mind for everyone. And so we'll absolutely be sending out more information and more opportunities for all of you to learn a bit more about all of this. So thank you again. Thanks for joining us, and hope everyone has a great rest of their afternoon. Bye-bye.